Heavy is the head that wears the crown, but heavier is the burden of being next in line. The British royal family is built on the traditional duty until death. For every heir to the throne, there is a spare.
I think that if you're the heir to the monarch, there's always a sense of preparation to become king or queen.
Well, Albert, who later became George VI, was very close to Edward as a younger man. And of course, Edward had the nickname of David, which all his family gave him. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Albert hero worshipped his elder brother.
George VI was the complete opposite of his brother Edward. He was reserved, he was anxious, he was shy, he was dutiful.
Edward VIII was, to many British people, like a movie star. He was somebody who was seen as this incredibly exciting figure, and George VI was not even a rep theatre star. He was somebody who was seen as lacking in any kind of glamour. So he knew this. I mean, he knew that he wasn't like his brother. But as a character, he was a much less likely king than Edward ever was.
Edward and George, two brothers, both would become king, but one was never crowned. The spare became the heir.
And I think that's very difficult because in these regal and aristocratic families, the heir is really conditioned and expected to become king and grows up with a sense of their destiny and all that entails. And the brother never really thinks that they are going to become king.
George VI approached his role as monarch seriously, with a sense of duty and diligence. He sought to emulate the best qualities of his father's reign.
He upheld a sense of responsibility. He completely committed to his duty, especially when he suddenly had to become king.
They were both princes, but only one was destined to be king.
I mean, there's no way that George can have been prepared for his role to be king.
George VI, when he became king, knew exactly what his duty was. He hated it, but he would never have dreamt from shirking it.
The House of Windsor was erected in 1917 during the rule of King George V. King George V was the second son of Albert Edward VII, Prince of Wales, the eldest son of Queen Victoria. King George V rose to the throne when his father passed away on the 6th of May 1910 and was coronated the following year at Westminster Abbey in June 1911. He served the nation for 26 years and fathered 6 children, 2 of whom were the future kings, Prince Edward and Prince Albert. The brothers quarreled growing up, and further tensions continued to grow later on.
So of his 4 sons, the 2 eldest, later Edward VIII and George VI, had a very difficult relationship with him because he was this cold figure and his wife Mary was cold as well. And there's very much a sense that everyone was brought up in a way to understand duty, and the idea of duty as the central tenet of what you were suspected to do as a royal prince was something that he laboured home intensively. And if we look at it now, we'd almost regard it as abusive because we look at the idea that these children were being treated in ways that were not humane and were not kind.
While we can say that George V was definitely a good king, we cannot say that he was a good father. And George and Mary were incredibly old-fashioned Edwardian parents, believing that children should be seen, even rarely, and not heard. Apparently, Freda Dudley Ward said of Edward that he had always said that he hated his father and his father was horrible to him. And while he loved his mother wouldn't let him love her, and that she always sided with the king. So it was an incredibly authoritarian, disciplined cold, emotionally unrewarding childhood. It's really interesting that Edward said of his childhood that Christmas was Dickens in a Cartier setting. And I think that really sums it up, that while they had the trappings of wealth and incredible luxury, there was tremendous neglect. And even when the family had no visitors, in the evening they would dress for dinner in full regalia, in tiaras, in diamonds, but there was no emotional warmth. The children were educated by pretty mediocre governesses and tutors. Edward later said that he had a curious type of loneliness.
Prince Albert was born in the winter of 1895, the second eldest son to King George V and Mary of Teck. Born 6 years before the death of his great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, the shy prince, known as Bertie to his family, grew up in the shadow of his elder brother, Prince Edward.
George VI was quiet as a child. He had a good relationship with his other siblings, but he wasn't as excitable as his older brother, Edward. Albert was a more withdrawn figure, closer to his father than his other brothers, and in keeping with his father's interests, he enjoyed the quiet life away in the countryside, out of the public eye.
George VI was the opposite of his brother Edward growing up. He was Albert, he was known as Bertie. He was shy, he was retiring, while his brother was outgoing. He wasn't as good looking as Edward, he wasn't as well dressed, he wasn't as charismatic, he didn't have the same success with women.
Edward's relationship with his younger brother Bertie was very warm when they were younger boys. There was very little between them in terms of their age, and they grew up best of friends. However, as the two men grew older, life became a bit more difficult. George had a very specific way that he wanted to live. He was much more of a kind of private figure. He was more withdrawn in terms of his public image. He didn't have the sort of the charisma and the glamour that was possessed by his older brother Edward. He didn't have a great deal of confidence. And the reason why he didn't have a great deal of confidence was because he had a stammer. Now, psychologists have sought to try and explain the stammer in relation to the fraught relationship that the royal children had with the king, with their father, George V, growing up, and that the young Bertie growing up had been almost terrified by his father and the expectations that his father had imposed on him. He didn't have a great deal of confidence. He wasn't as outgoing as other members of his family, and a bit more withdrawn. I think in that respect we can understand why later on he would be a more reluctant figure when it came to becoming king.
As a character, he was a much less likely king than Edward ever was, because he was somebody who didn't seem to be very comfortable around people.
Edward VIII is quite a difficult man to really pin down. At the end of writing my book about the Windsors, I was still conflicted about him, because in many ways he was very spoilt, he was very indulged. He was the opposite of his father, who had duty inbred in every pore, whereas with Edward, duty was drilled into him, which he really resented. So he wanted to be more spontaneous. He definitely was more modern. He went against the grain of his upbringing, the establishment, his background. He was a product of his upbringing. He was both spoilt and neglected.
But in terms of what he was like, he was quite amicable as a young man, because he was somebody who he enjoyed going to nightclubs, he enjoyed jazz, he enjoyed drinking.
So he definitely was a rule breaker. He wanted to push against the boundaries of convention. He followed his heart over his head. He was the antithesis of the emotionally contained, royal, dutiful king or heir apparent. He was definitely a dandy, Edward. I mean, it was extraordinary given who his parents were and their rigidly conformist, rather dull style of dress, that suddenly here was this character who championed the Prince of Wales check, who wore knickerbockers, who wore flamboyant clothes.
I mean, if you look at photographs of him as a young man, he knows what to do with a camera. I mean, he's got this star quality, which you simply cannot fake. And that, I think, is why he was somebody who was so beloved by so many people, because he was good looking and he was glamorous.
He was excited by change and innovation. As a man, he engaged in lots of outdoor pursuits, things like flying, golf, skiing, swimming. He was a real sort of showman in that respect. Edward was the soldier prince. He was expected, given his age, to set an example to other young men of his generation by going to the Western Front as a symbol of British manhood, of what other young men should be doing. Unfortunately, when he got there, he wasn't actually allowed to fight, and he found this very frustrating. He was kept away from the front line. He wanted to be on the front line. He wanted an opportunity to test his manhood, to test his masculinity, like other people of his class.
And it was completely devastating for him when they said that because of who he was, he couldn't risk going to the front. And when he was later awarded the Military Cross, he said that he felt a complete fraud. He didn't deserve it. He had a feeling of self-loathing that he had these positions, but he didn't feel worthy of them.
Like a lot of young privileged men, he saw the First World War, or the Great War as it was called, as a simple battle of good against evil, and of course he saw himself as being very much on the side of good. But what it did do, and this I think became crucial in his later life, was it also gave him a great respect for the Germans, because his family had German heritage, and he was, like a lot of his men, fighting against people who he didn't think were actually bad. He didn't think the Kaiser was bad, he just thought it was something that it was an unfortunate territorial war.
In January of 1936, King George V died suddenly at home in Sandringham House. His son, Edward VIII, became king, and Prince Albert became the spare. And by all accounts, he was happy with his role as spare, content with a life in the shadows. However, Edward's kingship wouldn't last long. Though the young and fashionable king was much beloved by the public, both palace and parliament were in agreement that he was not well suited to the job.
There was a great deal of affection for him among the British public because he had this special, intimate relationship with them. This continued when he was king. However, in terms of the business of government, he was less dutiful. He wasn't as exacting as his father. He wasn't as committed to going through government papers, to signing those off. Often courtiers would come home and find government documents covered in sort of stains from wine glasses and that sort of thing. He didn't take that work as seriously as he should have done.
Prince Edward, who later became Edward VIII, was quite possibly the most unsuitable man who ever became king. Everything about his character was entirely unsuited to the role of the monarchy. But this could be seen even as a young man, because from his university days at Magdalen College, Oxford onwards, he was somebody who escaped from this rather chafing boundary that he found himself under, because his parents had essentially told him all of his young life, you are going to be this dutiful prince, you are going to be king, you are going to do this, you're going to do that. By the time that Edward was of age, he had a simple answer to this: no, I'm not. And I suppose it was this tension between his upbringing and the values that had been instilled in him by governesses, by his parents, by courtiers, by all those around him, and his own inclinations that later spelt disaster both for him and nearly for the country.
Edward was in love with a woman who was not suitable for the king of the country, Wallis Simpson, an American socialite who had already been married and divorced prior to their relationship. But at the time, the rules were very clear. Remarriage after divorce was forbidden if a former spouse was still alive. It was hoped that the relationship would fizzle out. However, Edward's infatuation was far too strong to be broken by naysayers.
I think the sense that you get is that Edward is sort of in awe of a woman who refuses to placate him.
Edward really liked the fact that Wallis was sharp-tongued, quick-witted, she had a great sense of humour, and she didn't suffer fools. Always spoke to him as an equal. She didn't treat him as a kind of superior, and I think he liked the fact she would hold him to account. It was well known in high society that this affair between Wallis and Edward had been going on. Over the course of 1936, the British government also increasingly came to learn about the relationship. However, It was hidden from the British public, and this is because the great press barons, Lord Beaverbrook and Lord Rothermere, had conspired together to basically say to other Fleet Street editors of newspapers that they mustn't publish the story about Wallis and Edward, that this must be kept a closely guarded secret. This was because there was real concern about what the public response would be. And ultimately, they were very successful, Beaverbrook and Rothermere, in keeping this a closely guarded secret right through until the end of 1936.
One of the cruelest aspects of history in this respect is that everybody in the Prince of Wales and Mrs. Simpson circle who met Mrs. Simpson really liked her and really admired her and could see what a good influence she was on the king. However, it was the unholy trinity, as I call them, of palace, parliament and church who did not want Edward on the throne, and in my opinion, Mrs. Simpson became the suitable scapegoat for that.
Edward was faced with a choice. In addition to rising tensions between him, the government, and his controversial political views, he was faced with a dilemma of love. The king was given two options: put an end to his relationship with Wallis Simpson and find another suitor, or abdicate the throne and pursue his lover. (1936), the year that changed everything. Edward VIII ultimately followed his heart and abdicated the British throne in order to marry the woman he loved, leading the nation as king for only 325 days and becoming the first monarch in British history to abdicate the throne. He had chosen love over duty. The event triggered a constitutional crisis across the British Empire. Edward's decision upended his younger brother's life, as the shy Prince Albert became King George VI, and his two young daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, became next in line to the throne.
George VI was desperate not to become king. He was absolutely terrified by responsibilities of what would happen. But when he became king, he accepted it. He accepted that it was his responsibility and that it was something he would have to deal with. But in the end, the coronation went absolutely fine. And the thing was that Churchill was watching it with his wife Clementine. And he said, after he'd seen the king crowned, "You're quite right. It could never have been the other one." And I think the idea of George as the rightful king and Edward's reign as being a kind of strange anomaly was proved to many people by the fact the coronation was a success. It's extraordinary when you think about it that 1 year saw three kings of England, George V, Edward VIII and George VI. But I think what's very interesting also is they were completely different kinds of people. George V was the last of the Victorians. He was this stern, unbending, old-fashioned ruler. Edward VIII was the first modern monarch. He's somebody who probably bears more relation to the monarchy today than he did to his own time. He was somebody who prized personal happiness, personal fulfillment, and what he wanted to do over any concept of duty, any concept of conventional kingship. Then George VI was something else altogether. He was somebody who was completely ill-equipped for the job, which he never thought he'd have to do. He was somebody who was terrified by the responsibilities that came along with it. But what he had, which served him exceptionally well later, was, first of all, his father's sense of duty and his father's sense of the monarchy as something sacred. But he also had the ability to listen to people, which his brother never did. And that was what was so crucial.
This started a rivalry between Elizabeth and her sister Margaret, who would later become herself the spare to the heir. This was a highly controversial time, as George VI spent his entire life believing that his brother would become king and he could live a quiet life with his wife and two daughters out of the monarchy limelight. George VI was never supposed to be king. He was destined to live out his life as the spare heir, supporting and representing his older brother, the rightful heir. But from the 11th of December, 1936, this all took a turn.
When it became clear that Edward was thinking about abdicating the throne in order to marry Wallis Simpson, there was an enormously mixed reaction. You could essentially summarise it like this. The middle classes were horrified and disgusted because they saw the king having this relationship with a married woman and a divorced woman, something that was completely unacceptable. The working classes didn't think anything of this. They thought it was absolutely fair enough. That they loved the king, they wanted him to be happy, and they were very, very keen that he remain on the throne.
Edward made a speech immediately after he abdicated to the British people via the BBC radio airwaves.
And now we all have a new king. I wish him and you, his people, happiness and prosperity with all my heart. God bless you all. God save the king.
Edward always knew that abdication was a possibility. If we go and look at the diaries of his friends and associates earlier on in 1936, when they're talking about the affair before it's become public news, we know that Edward was already considering this idea that he might have to abdicate in order to marry the woman he loved. However, this was not plan A. He would have preferred to stay as king. This was a role he cared about deeply, that he wanted to play, and he wanted to marry the woman he loved. Ultimately, he was pushed towards option B, which was ultimately giving up the throne in order to marry Wallis.
In one sense, it wasn't a difficult decision at all, because the thing that he was most clear about was that he could not be an effective king without the support of the woman he loved, and that this relationship meant more to him than anything. However, for a man like that who'd been brought up in that household, obviously to abdicate was the most seismic, devastating event. And I think he genuinely felt terrible at letting the people who loved him down. I don't think it was a question of he felt guilt at betraying the palace or Parliament, because I think he felt they had betrayed him, actually.
Wallis did not want Edward to abdicate for the very simple reason that Wallis was terrified of what was going to happen to her. She enjoyed being the mistress of the Prince of Wales. She enjoyed the financial advantages it gave her, the social advantages it gave her, the gifts that were lavished upon her, the fact that she could live in the life and the style that she'd always been accustomed to. But as Edward's reign went on, she began to get more and more frightened because she was the subject of personal abuse. The house she was living in Regent's Park had its windows smashed. There was the constant worry that she was going to be attacked or worse. And she began to feel, by the time of the abdication crisis, that she did not want to be embroiled in this. So she actually fled to France when it was at its peak, and she tried very, very hard to give Edward up. But Edward would not give her up. And in fact, we've seen some of the letters and the telegrams they exchanged. And it's utterly terrifying because he was so obsessed by her. But at one point he said, of course you can go anywhere you want. You can go to China, you can go to Newfoundland, but wherever you will go, I will follow you.
When she tried to escape him prior to the abdication and say, look, you know, please don't do this. I shall watch you from afar. You can be an effective king. And just prior to the abdication, one of his courtiers said he was exalted to the point of madness, and at this point was sleeping with a loaded pistol under his pillow. And he literally emotionally blackmailed Wallis and said, if you leave me, I shall kill myself. And there was a really real possibility of that. He was so unhinged at this stage, and she just couldn't risk that.
King George VI potentially had one of the most stressful experiences as king. His first year as king saw the death of one and the abdication of another before his unexpected and unprepared shift to the spotlight.
George VI, or Bertie as he was known, was absolutely terrified at the idea of becoming king. It was something that he'd never wanted. He had a debilitating stammer, which meant that any kind of public speaking was nearly impossible for him. And it was with complete fear that he watched the rise of the abdication crisis, because he did not want to be king. He wanted to have a quiet, blameless life as a husband, a father, somebody who was a royal prince who's stammered his way through speeches he had to give, but he never ever wanted responsibility of actually ruling. And so he was looking at his brother and begging him not to abdicate, but Edward wasn't interested because his attitude was very bluff. It was to pat his brother on the back and say, never mind, old man, you'll do this much better than I ever did. So when he became king, it was with an almost impossible set of expectations. How on earth do you follow somebody who has not just been this popular, trend-setting figure, But he was given up before and abdicated. I mean, how do you follow that? And when he made his abdication speech from Windsor Castle on the evening of 11th December 1936, people were listening to it all over the country and they were weeping. It was a huge national moment because no king had ever abdicated before. And the fact that he was doing so for love, or at least what appeared to be love, made people feel this was a great sentimental passion.
We know that Bertie, as Edward's younger brother, was very anxious about becoming king. He wasn't a public figure on the same level as his brother had been. He wasn't very good in front of the cameras. He struggled to make speeches. He was a reluctant monarch in that respect, and he knew that becoming king would mean that he had to put his home life, his family, on the back burner, that he had to embrace duty, responsibility now first and foremost.
In the one sense, because he was so heart-led, it wasn't a difficult decision because his heart led the way. But I think in his head, obviously, there must have been conflict. And he loved his brother, and he knew the strain he was then going to be putting onto his brother. But as he said, Bertie was a better mould of king. He was going to be more dutiful. He had a more stoic, traditional wife in Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. In fact, Edward didn't cause collapse in the country. It was better for the country that he wasn't king.
It was decided that Edward could not remain in Britain any longer because it was felt that having an ex-king in his own country created a situation that was both rife with constitutional issues, but it was also difficult from a perspective of how he would be regarded, because there was always a fear of Edward having a kind of rival court because there was such public sympathy towards him.
After the abdication, Edward left Britain for Europe. He travelled to Austria. He had to wait 6 months to be reunited with Wallis, and that was because Wallis's divorce had to be finalised. Eventually, in May 1937, Edward and Wallis are finally reunited in France. The British press go wild. They've followed this story. They've waited for this moment of reunion, and really it was seen as a moment where that story, the scandal of the abdication, had finally come to a happy end.
When Edward and Wallis were finally reunited at the Chateau Condé in France, it's really very moving. I mean, he just rushed up the steps to be with her, and they were so tender at that stage because it really was them against the world. I mean, we have to remember that at the time of the abdication, Wallis was getting death threats in the terms of letters on her breakfast tray. And she actually said, you know, every morning when I receive these letters, I know that the world has turned against me, that the world hates me. She had become the most hated woman in the world.
Well, Edward became obsessed after the abdication, with Wallis being referred to as Her Royal Highness, and this was a real bugbear of his. He would bring it up constantly in letters to his brother, to his brother George VI. He'd bring it up in letters to the Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. He'd bring it up at every conceivable opportunity. But the problem was that in British society, there was such contempt and disdain for Wallis that nobody wanted to give her any kind of honorific title. And Edward was absolutely incensed by this because he saw correctly that it was a snub both to his wife and to him, and that nobody else would have been given this treatment. And you can see that his relationship with George VI, immediately after the abdication crisis, was reasonably civil. But before he got married, the relationship had more or less broken down between the brothers, and the letters they exchanged, open animosity on Edward's part, open anger, and increasingly on George's part, you can see this resignation mixed with a sense of, why don't you do what you're told?
When Prince Albert rose to power, he adopted one of his other names, George, and became King George VI. During the reign of Queen Victoria, she stated she never wanted a king to rule with the name Albert. She didn't want her own beloved Albert to be overshadowed by the reign of another. So, out of respect, Prince Albert adopted his new name. By 1920, the 25-year-old Prince Albert would start looking for a wife, and would find her in his longtime friend, Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. The couple were married on the 26th of April, 1923, in Westminster Abbey, and became the Duke and Duchess of York.
Bertie found his closest confidant and greatest supporter in his wife, Elizabeth. After a number of unsuccessful attempts to woo her and propose marriage to her, she eventually consented and agreed to marry him. There was some talk at the time about whether she was in fact more interested in his older brother, Edward, Prince of Wales, and that was one of the reasons why she originally turned Bertie down. Nevertheless, she would get married to Bertie. They would embody everything that was best about the monarchy in this period, in that they presented themselves as very dutiful figures. They went out into public life. They toured towns and cities. They opened hospitals. They did all that was expected of royals of their generation.
His relationship with his wife, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyons, who later became Queen Elizabeth, was, one doesn't want to sentimentalise these things, but it was a very happy relationship. The two of them had known each other for many years, very, very much in love. It was a very conventional match. There was no question that they would get married. They got married and had 2 daughters. And essentially it gave him a stability and a happiness that he'd always wanted. I suppose these days we call it anxiety that he suffered from, which led to the stammer. And she knew that he had this, and she thought the best way of dealing with it was to deal essentially by removing him from situations he wasn't comfortable in. She believed that he should be, if you like, wrapped up in a kind of cotton wool. But she was also somebody who loved him and was keen that he be kept away from the more taxing aspects of royal life. George VI, when he was a younger man, was devoted to his wife Elizabeth, the Queen, and to their children Elizabeth and Margaret. He was not somebody who was seeking the limelight. He was not somebody who wanted to have his name up in lights. He was somebody who would have much preferred a quiet, simple family life. And I think you can see that he served in World War I. He was somebody who was the first member of his own family to have done so, to have served on active service. He had a great respect for the armed forces, and you can see but if he never had become king, he would have been one of those figures within the royal family who was always well-liked, whose debilitating stammer meant that public speaking was a nightmare for him. But in private life, he was absolutely fine. He wasn't somebody who was affected by it to the extent that he was publicly.
1936 was the year of 3 kings. It was a year that greatly unsettled the British monarchy. Given how popular Edward had been, after he left, there was a great sense of disappointment, and a cloud hanged heavy over the British monarchy. And actually, George VI, the new king, he was really overshadowed by his brother, now titled the Duke of Windsor, through the early years of his reign. He had to do much to win back the loyalty and affection of the greater British public.
The public didn't really want George VI as king because they were largely enamoured of his brother.
George VI approached his role as monarch seriously, with a sense of duty and diligence. He sought to emulate the best qualities of his father's reign, notably emphasising how he was putting his life and his sense of duty ahead of all else, that he was a public servant, that he would continue in the vein of his father, trying to support Britain and the empire. And this image of him was, of course, in direct contrast with his brother, who had put personal fulfillment ahead of national duty.
Bertie had suffered from a stammer from childhood, but it was massively worse and exacerbated by his responsibilities when he reached adulthood, because he would have to give speeches, and he hated it. He hated it because he felt completely ill-equipped to do so, and he would actively try and avoid opportunities of doing so because he felt embarrassed. The problem is that what he realised, especially when his father was alive, was that you can't duck these responsibilities. And so he had these horrendously embarrassing experiences that he would go and address for kind of low-grade events that you needed a member of a royal family to be at. And he'd often find himself making noise rather than a conventional speech, which is why he needed to have a speech therapist who could actually help him. So the speech therapist that he hired, or rather was hired for him by his wife, was this man called Lionel Logue, who was an Australian. And Logue was very unconventional because he didn't believe that the way of dealing with speech therapy was to be formal about it. He dealt with the king, who he called Bertie informally, as if they were friends, as if they were working on the same level. And the film The King's Speech offered a fictionalised account of this, and it's broadly accurate in what it suggests, that there was this friendship that arose between them.
Would that be agreeable? Of course.
Yes, and that would be the full extent of your services.
Shall I see you next week?
I shall see you every day. Feel the looseness of the jaw. Good, little bounces, bounces. Shoulders loose, shoulders loose.
The speech therapy was very effective for Bertie in that he did gain in confidence. Notably, the impediment would never fully go away. Bertie would continue to stammer, but nevertheless, he became a much more confident and competent public speaker than he had been before.
Cannot long be separated. It is well that we have, in one of the world capitals, a visible reminder of so great a truth. Without freedom, there can be no enduring peace, and without peace, no enduring freedom.
When he became king, he accepted it. He accepted that it was his responsibility and that it was something that he would have to deal with. And although there are people who sneered at him, such as the diarist Chips Channon, for lacking glamour, for not being a charismatic figure, for his stutter, he was somebody who was trying his very best. And I think that's what you can see the king as being, somebody who was trying to be like his father, not like his brother.
The memorial seems to me finally conceived and finally executed. It's fortunate also in the position it occupies.
On the morning of the 3rd of September, 1939, Great Britain and the British Empire declared war on Nazi Germany. Only 3 years into his sudden ascent to the throne, George, who was still seeking to gain the favour of his people, would now face a Second World War, this time as king. This marked the start of World War II for Britain and the first major global conflict of George VI's reign. King George served in the Royal Navy during the First World War. He had war experience, but now he was at the forefront of decision-making as the highest military power within the empire.
The day that war was declared against Germany was a great moment of sadness and concern for the British public. They understood why this point had been reached, that Hitler had time and again broken promises, and as a result, Chamberlain and Chamberlain's government had been forced to declare war on Germany. In this moment of crisis, the British public, I think, were looking for leadership not just from the government, but also from the British royal family. They were looking for reassurance that everything would be okay and that the nation would get through this moment of peril.
In this grave hour, perhaps the most fateful in our history, I send to every household of my people, both at home and overseas.
The Duke of Windsor, as both Prince of Wales and then as King Edward VIII, had taken a real interest in Anglo-German relations. He took a particular interest in the Nazi regime because he saw Hitler as a dynamic, charismatic leader, much like himself. When he'd been Prince of Wales and then King, he'd also been very impressed with what the Nazi Party had done in resolving Germany's unemployment crisis in the mid-1930s. Some historians and biographers have gone as so far to suggest that Edward was a fascist sympathizer. Notably, his official biographer never went as far as to suggest that, but it was certainly the case that Edward was very interested in what the Nazis had achieved in Germany and where they were taking the nation.
Edward felt this tremendous seam of guilt that he had promised Wallis, in a way, the world, and had been able to deliver very little of it. So he couldn't give her the title. I mean, I'm convinced that one of the reasons he bought her so many lavish jewels was to compensate for the fact that she couldn't have the real crown jewels. He wanted to treat her like his queen, and in fact, in all his royal houses, everybody had to address her as HRH, they had to bow and curtsy to her. So when the Germans, cleverly, seeing how weak he was, said, "Will you come on a tour?" And Edward said, "Will you treat this like a royal tour? Will you give my wife the pomp and pageantry she deserves?" And they said yes. So of course he went thinking at last he could show Wallis what it would be like to be a royal queen, a consort on a royal tour, completely, I think, naively and unaware to the optics. But I do not think that this meant he was a Nazi sympathiser. The other historians I've spoken to don't think that either. I think he was too politically and intellectually stupid to adhere to any ideological or political creed. I genuinely do. All he wanted was recognition for his wife and the status that she deserved.
Sure I am that this day, now, we are the masters of our fate.
After May 1940 and the defeat of France, Edward and Wallis flee for, first of all, Spain and then Portugal. Whilst they're there, again, a sort of conspiracy seems to encircle them about whether Edward would in fact like Germany to defeat Britain by bombing it into submission and then put him back in charge of the British monarchy. So there are all these plot conspiracies, rumours involving Edward possibly returning to Britain as a kind of puppet monarch. And the bombing of Buckingham Palace in that respect represented an opportunity to demonstrate that royalty, that crown and people were suffering together.
Buckingham Palace was bombed on several occasions in World War II. The most spectacular one came relatively early in the war, when bombs landed sufficiently close to George VI and to Queen Elizabeth and to their Private Secretary Alec Harding. But if it hadn't been for a couple of minor bits of chance, they almost certainly would have been killed. And it's very interesting to see this, because whoever bombed Buckingham Palace knew exactly what they were doing. They knew exactly which parts of the palace the King and Queen would have been in. They knew exactly where to hit it. So there was clearly somebody working off some kind of intelligence, which was not intelligence the general public would have had, and it's certainly not intelligence the Nazi Germany would have had. And the question that you have to ask is, how would you have got that intelligence, were it not for the fact there was somebody who was at loose, who would have been able to tell people exactly, if you wanted to bomb Buckingham Palace and kill my family, this is how you do it. And of course, the question is, did Edward actually want to see George VI and the Queen killed? I don't know is the answer to that, because on the one hand, he didn't like his brother, he was angry with his brother, but was he actually a traitor?
It's decided by George VI, his private secretary, and Winston Churchill, now British Prime Minister, that Edward needs to be sent away, that he needs to be out of the public eye, and they decide that he would be best placed as governor of the Bahamas across the Atlantic Sea, where he can do no harm.
Edward felt very slighted to have been given this role of governor of the Bahamas. I mean, you can absolutely understand that you have been King of England, King Emperor, you know, you've ruled over this empire of 500 million people, and you're now going to this tiny island in the Bahamas to be the governor. He felt insulted because after the abdication, he always wanted to have a suitable role, a job within England, and he really did fight for that, but you know, that was not going to be granted by the Queen Mother and Tommy Lascelles. What's really interesting, I think, about his time in the Bahamas is, of course, you know, the press said Wallis was too extravagant at doing up Governor's House and spending all this money, but I spoke to people whose children, whose parents knew the Windsors in the Bahamas, and they were incredibly liked. They did a lot for local people, for charities. They really threw themselves into the role. And I think it's really telling that when Edward came back to Britain for his mother's funeral, that the crowds, 5,000 people turned up, and they all called out to him and said, you know, sir, and doffed their caps. So that shows the respect of the, not really the respect, the love of the people for this man.
Would you like to have gone on and had another job after that, sir?
Yes, I offered my services if they were required. Never got any.
Would you like the Duke to have had a job?
Oh, yes, very much, very much.
In those days, that's 25 years ago.
I think he could have done something.
Well, why didn't you get a job, do you think?
Have to ask.
After the palace was bombed, they're both absolutely terrified. The king wrote in his diary that he couldn't quite believe what had happened and that he was very, very lucky to have escaped. But days later, he's still writing, I look outside, and I can't forget seeing the bomb. It's quite clear that it had a kind of traumatic effect on both of them. There was a real sense of the traditional bounds coming down, a real sense that they were all in it together. So George was aware that in addition to being his country's king, he was also acting as a kind of global ambassador. And for somebody who was not a naturally outgoing figure, it was a very difficult experience for him. But in fact, as the war went on, he found himself taking on an active role in terms of making decisions and liaising with people at the very, very highest levels. And he found himself becoming almost a military leader in and of his own right.
The enemy who drove all Europe into war has been finally overcome.
I think that what he understood was that despite being king, he'd come to understand the daily lives of his subjects sufficiently well. And making this speech, he was able to acknowledge there were going to be hard times ahead. And so while you look at the speech now and you think that's not entirely what you'd expect from somebody who's just won the war, you understand it far better when you understand his character and the kind of things that somebody would do in that situation. When VE Day finally happened, George and his family were in the palace, and this great cry went up, "We want the king, we want the king." And I think that although he was overawed by it, and although obviously being a naturally shy and retiring man, it was a lot for him to take on, it was still a recognition that over the course of the Second World War, he had gone from being this figure who had been regarded with a sense of suspicion, a sense of distrust almost by the public who had preferred his brother, to being this lauded figure, along with Churchill, who was there on the balcony with him, that the two men were seen as absolutely indistinguishable in terms of their contribution to the war effort, in terms of their importance for the British national character. And I think he ended the war an exceptionally popular monarch.
After the war had ended, King George developed a heavy smoking habit, which is believed to have caused him to develop lung cancer. He later died in his sleep at the age of 56 in 1952. The King's funeral was held at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, where he lies buried.
I think it's fair to say that the two things that destroyed George's health and led him to an early death were first of all his becoming king at all, and secondly the sheer stress of what he had to do in World War II, because if a war had never happened, if a peace had been sought with Hitler that had then been agreed, he may have lived longer, but he was faced with the most horrendous stress and pressure. You can understand why. If you've been faced with that level of trauma, it's not going to be something you can walk away from very easily.
There was a real sense of shock when George VI died, not least because he was still such a young man, only in his 50s. The king had not started off as a very popular figure when he came to the throne in late 1936, but nevertheless, he was associated with the war effort. He had demonstrated that he was dutiful, that he was diligent, and through that, he had earned their loyalty and affection.
Unlike his own father, George was a dedicated family man and doted on his children, referring often to his family unit as us four. His family was what kept him grounded throughout his life. Knowing that she would someday be queen, George VI taught his daughter Elizabeth everything she needed to know about being monarch and the head of the armed forces. But when the young princess embarked on a tour of Kenya with her husband, in 1952, she never expected to return as queen.
It was an enormous shock for Elizabeth. I mean, she hadn't expected her father to die. You don't want to sentimentalise these things because you don't want to make it look as if it's, you know, a heartbroken queen. But she was a relatively young woman, recently married, and she lost her father. And in addition to personal loss, she knew she was going to have to become queen. I think that was an incredible moment because you know at that stage that you've got to change your entire life and you'll never have your own life again. And it was felt also that his death was, in a sense, it was as if Churchill had died. It was as if this great hero, this person who led them through the war had gone. And I think there was a sense of uncertainty as to who Elizabeth would be, as to what kind of queen she'd be, this young woman who, the highest profile thing she'd done had been to get married and to make a few speeches, but she wasn't a known quantity. And I think, again, as at the end of 1936, there was a real sense of what happens next, what happens now. I think we can see throughout George VI's reign, there's a pattern. There's this incredibly difficult thing which has to be overcome. George was not felt to be up to it. And then through a combination of strength of character, listening to people, and sometimes just luck, it always was overcome. And that was a fascinating run of luck, if you like. I think that the greatest legacy of King George VI is actually his daughter. I think that she's always reigned very much as her father's daughter. She's reigned as somebody who has prized constancy, stability, good humour, an ability to connect with people in a way that they've always found reassuring, and also a sense that monarchy has to be something of a continuation. The Queen has never been somebody who has seen the monarchy as an opportunity to showboat, unlike her uncle. She's seen monarchy as a duty, and I think that is very much her father's influence. He was faced with the most horrendous situation that anybody has faced with in the 20th century, and he was a successful king during it. And despite his ill health, despite his stammer, despite his shyness, despite his character, he was able to instill in his children, especially his eldest daughter, a sense that this is how you conduct yourself, this is how the royal family has to behave, and we see his influence every day today.
Edward VIII died on March the 28th, 1972. In his will, he left everything to his beloved Wallis and the British royal family.
When Edward VIII died, the public reaction was one of tremendous grief, even though he had been in exile and even though he had, as the British people saw it, forsaken them. Such was the strength of his popularity and charisma that there was still an affection for him. So, of course, his death was a terribly sad time for the country. Those that remembered him with affection. All the spite and all the blame was unfairly meted out to Mrs. Simpson, and he was still the golden boy. The legacy was love. That his legacy was he gave up everything for the woman that he loved. And that's what we remember him most for.
The early life of the quiet Prince Albert was overshadowed by his gregarious elder brother and heir to the throne, Edward. And his life was shaped by the trauma of a decision that was never his own, his brother's abdication. He instilled this sense of duty to both his family and country into his daughter, who would become Queen Elizabeth II, the longest reigning monarch in British history. Had King George VI been alive to see Elizabeth and Margaret grow up to lead independent yet close lives, his feelings would only grow for his daughters. The now fraught relationship between Princes William and Harry has echoes stretching back more than 100 years. Now it is the conscientious and dedicated George VI we remember for steering Britain through the dark days of the Second World War, defying a debilitating stammer to do so. And it was Edward, the one with the good looks, athleticism and confidence, who was cast out into ignominious exile. From the start, George and Edward seemed born for their respective roles of the heir and the spare. But the heir was never crowned, and the one who was not born to rule was destined to reign.
I think that the legacy of King George is so strong precisely because it's contrasted against the legacy of his brother. So Edward is seen as somebody who jettisoned the throne of England, and George is seen as somebody who didn't want it, who sat on it and did his very best on it and brought great stability to the country, and also had this secure, tight family that played out so well with the British people. But to his credit, Edward did have a sense of that and did allude to that in his abdication speech, that they were in very safe hands with his brother, who had the love of a dutiful and warm wife and had this sense of family and would be a better king as a result.